welcome to another edition of In Focus brought to you by the UONGOZI Institute. My name is Gwamaka Kifukwe. We all know that the world is changing. We're in the midst of an African renaissance. We're seeing uncertainties in the West and growth of economies in the East, and even seeing emerging groups of countries such as BRICS coming onto the stage as powers. But change also brings opportunity. And with me in studio today, we're extremely privileged to have Dr. Martin Khor, the Executive Director of the South Center. He's here to discuss with us how Africa can best position itself to readjust its partnerships and deliver the sustainable development that is so critical to the people here of Africa. Dr. Khor, thank you for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I just want to start fresh off the boat. We say the world is changing. What does that actually mean?
Well, the world is changing in so many ways. We have an environmental crisis. We have climate change. We are running out of resources. So we have to rethink our paradigm of development into one that is sustainable. The world has also changed in that in the last 5 years or so, we are seeing a global financial crisis. Although there has been some recovery, there's again a new crisis in Europe. So this has not only led to problems for developing countries, including Africa, such as uncertainties in the prices of commodities. Many countries are rethinking whether they should be so dependent on trade and exports or whether they should look to their own region. So many questions are emerging. The nature of the market that many countries were taught that the market cannot do any wrong. So if the government deregulates and allow the markets to function on their own, then this will be the best way in which the economy can grow. The foundations of this theory have been shaken to its core because the epicenter of this crisis has been in the United States and Europe, and particularly in the financial sector, where banks and financial companies, when they were deregulated, they speculated, they invented new instruments that nobody knew about, and that has caused a crash in the United States. Also, countries in Europe that were heavily borrowing from other countries and became dependent on the markets found that they are facing a debt crisis. So it's not only Africa or Latin America that can fall into debt crisis as we did maybe 2 decades ago. It's even these big countries that had thought that if you deregulate and let the markets go by itself, then everything is okay. And now we have seen that it's not okay. So we have to rethink the relationship between the market and the state, the regulation that needs to be done, the role of the state. And we need, in Africa and in other developing regions, to learn the lessons from this crisis. But the world has also changed in that the developing countries today, as compared to 2 decades or 3 decades ago, as a whole, the developing countries are not as weak as before. In the past, we were very weak in 2 ways. One is that our economies were poor. We were dependent very much on aid to keep our economies afloat. We were dependent on the World Bank and the IMF for loans to prevent us from defaulting on our debt, and therefore we had to take on many policy conditions, of which many of them were proven to be not so appropriate for our development. But today we are not so dependent on the World Bank and the IMF. We are not so dependent on aid, although we are still to some extent dependent. So the world has changed in that we are able now to have the space to think of our own policies. The question is whether we learn the lessons and choose the right policies, because now we have the ability to choose, And the world has also changed in terms of the South, in that in the past, when there were many international negotiations, such as in the Uruguay round, in the trade area, and in many other negotiations, bilateral negotiations, and so on, our developing countries and their negotiators were not prepared enough so that when they negotiated, it was on a position of weakness. Sometimes we didn't even appear on a negotiating table. In Geneva, for example, during the Uruguay round, there were many developing countries that did not have an embassy in Geneva, and therefore they did not take part in the negotiations. They just had to accept what other people had negotiated. And other countries, although they were on the negotiating table, they were very weak because sometimes the embassy had only 1 or 2 people, whereas the United States or Europe, they may have 50 people, you know, and they know every word and full stop that they put forward. The proposals were put forward by the rich countries, and we were merely reacting.
Okay.
And this is still basically the situation today, but we are much better organized. In the WTO, for example, we now have the Africa group. We have the group of least developed countries. We have the group of 33 countries that are fighting for food security in the trade rules. Although I must say that still in negotiating terms, we are still the weak partner, especially the LDCs, you know, but it's much better than before. As you said, some things still haven't changed. If you look at the IMF and World Bank and the voting structure, this is still under the control of the developed countries, the World Bank and IMF. And the multinational companies that have become bigger and stronger are the multinational companies of the developed countries by and large.
You mentioned groupings of countries and so forth. So if we take Africa as, you know, this group of nations, how have the changes that are happening globally that you've just described, how is that affecting the partnerships that are available to Africa as a grouping?
Well, Africa in the past had a very bad image, you know, so that affected its ability to negotiate. I mean, there was this image of Africa that it's always in conflict. There are many countries that are at war. The countries are led by dictators who rob the countries of their money, and so on and so forth. So that was the image until recently. Recently that has changed because many countries have become more democratic, elections. It's difficult for a dictator that took over from a coup d'etat and is not doing well for the country to remain very long. So I think on the democratic front, although there are still, of course, many areas of conflict and so on, there has been an improvement on the ground and also in image on the democratic side. In terms of the economy, Africa has been doing rather well as compared to the past. There are growth rates of 5 to 7% for many countries. Some countries have even exceeded that. That although most African countries are still LDCs and they are still generally poor, but they are now able more to tackle the issues of poverty, food insecurity and so on. So that has also boosted the image of Africa. And then on the third side, I think the regional organizations, particularly the African Union, which is now celebrating its 50th anniversary. So this is a great occasion to celebrate, because even if you compare to Asia, for example, Africa is much more organized regionally than Asia. We don't have Asian developing countries union, for example. So politically speaking, I think there has been a lot of evolution and development in regional integration, politically as well as economically. You have these 5 regional economic commissions in which Tanzania is part of quite a number. And they have set up joint customs unions. There is a political commitment to integrate more and so on. I think there's a commitment for a free trade area for the whole of Africa. This was mandated by the African Summit last year. So you can see that Africa is organizing itself. Okay. You also have new developments in the last many years of China, which is an emerging economic power, having dialogues with African leaders very regularly. I think it's once a year. And India is now doing a similar thing. So these are the giants of Asia. That's why I'm mentioning the 2. We have Brazil coming in, starting with President Lula, who was very committed to developing cooperation relationships with Africa and many African countries. And now I think you have a Latin American summit with Africa as well. So these things begin. At first they may not seem to be very effective, but that's the beginning of things.
I mean, with regards to North-South relations, the typical sort of historical trend has been for aid to flow, from the rich North to the poor South. And again, this relationship is changing as well. You are now increasingly seeing that the North does need the South in terms of a market for its goods, for some expertise as well, for innovation and so forth. How much of a role does the traditional relationship, this aid relationship, still have to play in terms of the relationship between Africa and, say, Europe?
I think if the trade relationship is mutually beneficial and Africa is able to expand on the basis of fair trade, with Europe or with America and so on, then as the GNP grows, as the economies grow, and if you have the right kind of development policies where the growth also is spread out through the population rather than being concentrated only among the elites, then of course we will have less and less need for depending on aid. But if the trade relationships are not equal, not mutually beneficial, and therefore the countries in Africa that take part in this trade relationships do not benefit so much, then you will still be dependent on aid to the degree that the countries are depleted of funds. But aid is not a panacea, as we know, because aid is very often tied. They are tied to conditions, they are tied to policies that may not be beneficial to the country. And therefore, sometimes you wish that I can do away with this aid, and then I will have the ability to do the policies that I want, that are beneficial for my people. This is why there are many calls now, including from prominent Africans. For example, the chairman of the South Centre, Benjamin Mkapa, he has called for the ending of aid dependence. We are not calling for the ending of aid, but the dependence that comes with aid and the wrong policies that come as conditions to the aid. If we have the right kind of aid, for example, we are helping victims of HIV/AIDS, okay, and they cannot afford medicines because they are poor. Then if the aid agencies are able to negotiate that the price of medicines go down, instead of paying $10,000 for each patient, you pay, say, $70 for each patient, which is now happening because we are able to buy generic medicines from India at $70 when the original price is $10,000 from the United States companies. So this is a great move, And then if you have donor agencies that are able to procure the medicines and send it to poor African countries where the government is not able to pay either $10,000 or even $70, then this is an immediate assistance, a humanitarian assistance to patients who otherwise would die unnecessarily from AIDS or malaria or cholera and so on. But in the free trade agreements, the bilateral free trade agreements, you have an opposite ethos, that is being pushed by the developed countries. For example, in the economic partnership agreement with Europe that Africa is now negotiating, the European position is that the African countries, including LDCs, you have to cut your tariffs to zero for 80% of the products, and then implement this zero tariff, some of them immediately, but to complete the whole thing, say, within 15 or 20 years or 25 years. So this is too drastic because this is totally opposite from the philosophy that we now have in the WTO, that poor countries don't have to cut their tariffs.
Given that sort of background, then, how does Africa or African countries position themselves to be able to negotiate partnerships that are beneficial?
I think the first thing is for African countries to not just look outward, but to look internally to determine what kind of development policies they want to have and they need to have. Okay. For example, I've been talking to the Trade Minister of South Africa, And there are many lessons that he has learned and that he's sharing on with others. He now has a new sort of industrial policy, they call it industrial policy, and they've chosen maybe 10 or 12 sectors that they would like to develop an industry on in South Africa. And then he's looking at, and his priority is to create jobs and to create growth and income that can provide the jobs, because you have 20%, 30% unemployment in South Africa. Okay? So his priority is to do that. And he needs to develop local industries in order to provide jobs. Of course, you can also get foreign companies to come in, but you can't totally depend on foreign companies to do this. Most of the job creation has to be by local companies, including the SMEs. So given this as the objective, as Minister of Industry, then as Minister of Trade, he's saying, what is a trade policy that I need to have to fit into my industrial policy? And then the role of tariffs comes in. It doesn't mean that you should eliminate your tariff to zero. That might make it impossible for some of the industries to develop, including new industries. So he has his tariff policy and his trade policy to fit into the industrial plan. Then he's looking at the financial policy. Are the companies able to get loans cheaply with low interest rates? Is the exchange rate overvalued, and therefore, we cannot sell our products abroad? And finally, is the financial system providing loans to the consumers, to the poor, to the farmers, what is now called inclusive finance?
Yeah.
And he said, I'm going to talk to my Minister of Finance to see whether we can have a kind of financial policy that fits. And finally, we need a development bank, an industrial bank that is able to lend to entrepreneurs for a period of 10 or 15 years. The commercial banks will not lend you for such a long period. So can we revitalize the development bank in order to fit into this? And finally, he said, I'm looking at my intellectual property laws because they are outdated and I have to reform them so that my industries will be able to do innovation and will be able to, upgrade their technology and so on without being overburdened by patent laws that are too strict, that forbid the industry to be able to transfer the technology. And can we also have social policies that do not burden the poor? Of course, the trade minister himself had gone to Brazil, had visited China, Asia, and then picked the lessons that he could apply to South Africa. But this kind of pragmatic, this is really not ideological, it's pragmatic.
Yeah.
And the pragmatism is that we need to create the right kind of growth for the right kind of jobs, So learning this lesson, I think we have to turn it the other way around and say, what is it that can get local industry going, local entrepreneurs going, the government as a partner to the local private sector, so that it can help the local private sector through the provision of loans, as South Africa is doing, through encouraging them to upgrade their technology, through helping them to organize themselves so that they can export. But more important than export, if they can produce for their own domestic market and then to the regional market. Sure. So if you are talking of partners in economic development, the most important partners will be within the own region itself. And in this case, it is the East African community, plus all the other African countries. Africa as a continent is a huge potential market that is very reachable because you are in the region. And the statistics that we have researched on in the South Centre shows actually that African exports in manufactures to other African countries is growing at a far higher pace than African exports to the European Union, for example, in manufactures. So if you are thinking of developing your industries, then the real market is in Africa rather than in the rich countries. And your market can also develop in other southern regions like Asia or Latin America. Very importantly, with China or with India, for example, we are selling commodities to you.
Yeah.
Okay? So can we think of a way in which we can have commodities trade that is slightly different from the traditional commodities trade in which the commodity producer is always dependent, the prices are volatile, and the demand is fluctuating here and there. Can we go into a stable relationship with you so that we have a reasonable price over a longer period, which is also beneficial to you? And can we be allowed to add value to our commodities? I don't want to sell you cocoa. If I can, I will sell you chocolate, yes. And can I bring this in my own ships to your country rather than in your ship, so that I can earn the value added in processing, in manufacturing, and in shipping? And I think the other southern regions will be very sympathetic to this because they face the same problem. We read in a newspaper in Kenya that the importers in China, they have an import association. They came to visit Kenya, and it was in the Kenyan newspaper. The importers said that we are very keen to buy coffee from Kenya because the Chinese really love coffee now. And what we can offer you is you can process the coffee. We don't need to get the raw coffee.
So we just want coffee.
We want coffee. And you can bring it in your own ships.
As long as we get coffee.
So this is quite remarkable. In other words, can we get more out of our commodities than we traditionally have?
Sure.
Okay? So this very high growth that we are seeing in Africa as compared to the past is not something that we can be complacent about, because much of this growth was fueled by the boom in commodity prices, and that boom may not last. So when that boom ends, and it could be very soon, then we may face the same problems all over again, and it's better to prepare for them. So whilst we are optimistic and happy for Africa, I think Africa needs to prepare itself for the long run, and that we need a concrete development plan and strategy, as I said, the one that I know about South Africa. I'm sure there are many others, and we need to implement these plans.
Just to summarize, if I've understood you correct, Africa really actually needs to look internally and think very pragmatically, and then find innovative ways to solve those problems, favoring, looking domestically and then regionally, and then looking outside.
I think this is it, because once you know what you want to do nationally and regionally, then when people come to you to be a partner, you can gauge whether the terms of that partnership are appropriate to your plan. Okay? And I said that many free trade agreements, the models of the free trade agreement from Europe, from the United States, they are not very suitable to developing countries that are trying to develop. So if those kinds of terms are not very suitable, then you can negotiate for more suitable terms. And if the partner does not agree, then you can look for other partners. You see, the world has changed, and that there are many other partners now.
Sure.
But again, we don't want South-South relations to be
just to
replace North-South relations that are imbalanced. The South-South relations have to be balanced, and especially have to have affirmative action in favor of the weaker partners. This is our lesson from North-South relations, that very often they are not so equitable. So there is a potential for South-South cooperation to expand tremendously, but the question is, will it expand in a way that is balanced and mutually beneficial, that does not replicate imbalanced relations between the North and the South? But it is not a romantic thing that will automatically happen. We need to know what is good for us, what is good for our development, and then seek the partnerships that can fit into our development thinking and plan. And I think this is a challenge not only for Africa, but for all the developing countries.
I get the sense that you feel Africa's in the right, at least starting to move in the right direction. But just in closing, do you have any other thoughts or comments, anything you'd like to share with the rest of Africa regarding this situation, about looking for partnerships to enable that sustainable development?
Yeah, I think the main thing is not to go out and look for partners, but to find out what is it that is what you want to do. This is the hard work. And in doing so, we can learn the lessons of all other countries before us. And once we are able to learn the lessons and come out with a clear plan for ourselves and for the region, then you seek the partners that can benefit you, that can fit into this plan. I think the complacency, the other way of doing it is to say, well, I'm not very sure what I want to do, but I'm going out to look for partners. And then our criteria of success is how how many partnerships have we managed to get. And then we don't look at the content of the partnership to see whether it's suitable or not. And then we end up in a very messy situation where you're obliged to do this because this partner wanted, you're obliged to do that because this partner wanted. Everybody is talking of partnerships, but the question is what partnerships you want. And within the country itself, what are the partnerships you want between the government enterprises, which is different from the government, the private sector, which includes the main private sector is the small farmers, because it is the private sector, but it is made up of individual farmers that are very small. So how do you want them to relate to the government and to themselves? The small and medium-sized companies in industry and in services, and the big companies that are local. So what is that relationship that the government has to have, including in expanding perhaps its own state enterprises in the right way? But if you do it the wrong way, then it's inefficient. But we cannot give up on state enterprises either, because there are certain things that are natural for state enterprises.
Sure.
For example, water supply, electricity, you might say schools, hospitals, and so on. These are the natural purview of government, But then you have the private sector, and how are you able to incentivize and develop the private sector, which is a very difficult thing. What are the government policies and incentives you need to give so that the private sector can develop? For example, this is what happened in Korea, this is what happened in Japan when they were a poor country. What are the policies that we can learn from it? And at the same time, you have the foreign companies that are knocking on the door, trying to come in. In fact, some of them are not coming in that you want to come in. Some of them you don't want to come in are willing to come in. This includes, say, those in the mining sector, in the big agricultural sector. What are the contracts you can sign with them that will maximize the benefits to the country? So the contracts are very important, and many countries are learning the experience that the production contracts that you sign, you don't want to be cheated. You want to get the best out of it.
Sure.
But you also want to be fair to the foreign investor.
Sure.
And therefore, what kind of partnerships with these foreign companies, that can maximize your benefit and minimize the costs? And finally, what are the relationships that government can have with other governments that can promote the right kind of mixture on the economic front? Because you may need to have right kind of partnership with the governments in other developing countries for South-South cooperation, and with northern governments for the kind of North-South relationships that we must also transform and change into a mutually beneficial one.
Sure.
So these are all the partnerships that are quite complex, but the world is quite complex.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your time and for joining us on the program. Welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much.